Hey, it was Mr. Norris,
And Mr. Lawrence.
and we're here today to cover video number 6 in Colonial America. We're going to deal with origins of slavery in the Americas, both North and South America, or the Western Hemisphere, as we'll talk about it. So let's start off talking about the origins of slavery in the United States, and make sure you read along with us here and fill in your packet this information. So by 1700, the institution of slavery, involving Africans primarily, already served to highlight the regional differences between the North and South in the colonies. So that term regional, we're going to see slavery develop a lot more so in the South than in the North and really any other area of what will be America.
So, ladies and gentlemen, this is something that you have talked about previous in your study of global history, this idea of triangular trade, because the next question asks us really, how does slavery begin in the Americas? And we've also talked about earlier in other videos the idea that slavery is going to be an issue that the founders will have to deal with from the very beginning. And triangular trade is the reasons why we see it. If you follow along, it says colonial trade routes that move humans, natural resources, and manufactured goods between Africa, Europe, and the Americas. In the Americas, we're seeing colonies start to develop natural resources and cash crops, sending those to places like Europe. From Europe, we will see manufactured goods, and from Africa, we will see humans being brought to the Americas for specific reasons.
And when we're talking about the triangular trade, if you can look down here in this picture, it's called the triangular trade because it connects three major areas: the Americas, both North and South, and then also Europe and Africa. What we're going to focus on is this little leg part here today of the triangular trade. This is often called the Middle Passage, and we will talk about that. That's the journey that Africans would take to become slaves in the Americas. So why was there this growth for slavery? What work were African slaves forced to do for slave owners? And the answer is agricultural manual labor. You will see overwhelmingly slaves are forced to work on farms, usually tobacco farms early in American history, and later on cotton plantations as well. And they would also be on rice and sugar plantations as well.
All right, so something we also have to be aware of at this time period is the different form of labor that existed within the colonies, some being forced by choice, others being something a little different. And the first term that we've talked about is indentured servitude. And what an indentured servant was something different than an actual slave. And it was an individual who had a contractual obligation, which means they really signed a contract and they gave up part of their time to serve someone else. In return, they would actually receive passage to the Americas. So they would provide really manual labor many times for a certain time period, and then they would gain their freedom and the opportunity to start their own life.
And indentured servants, guys, it's important to note, really, that was a choice, that these were Europeans who made a choice to come to the Americas, mostly because they didn't have enough money to pay their passage. So somebody else would pay their passage. They chose to come over and work for a period really anywhere from 4 to 7 years. So that was a choice, unlike the next term, slave, which is generational forced labor. And that word generational means that it is based on your family. So if your mother was a slave, then you would automatically be a slave when you are born. And there is absolutely zero opportunity to gain freedom, or at least very little opportunity to gain freedom. The expectation was at this time that if you were born a slave, you will remain a slave for your entire life, and so will any future family members that you will have, any children that you might have.
So for this course, it's important to understand the difference between the two, between an indentured servant and a slave. So we'll give you a second if you think you can write it down. All right, so hopefully you identified that the difference between indentured servant and a slave is that an indentured servant can eventually gain their freedom.
Okay, so we're going to talk about the arrival of slaves now, and I hinted at the Middle Passage earlier. And again, this is the sea journey of slave ships from Africa to the Americas, both North and South America. And it is estimated that millions of African deaths occurred during forced migration into slavery. And as many as 1 out of 4 or 1 out of 5 Africans would actually die on the journey over on the ships because the conditions were that horrific. There were as many people as possible cramped into really tight areas of the ship. And this journey could last anywhere from 3 to 5 weeks as well, just on the ship. This is really a horrible situation.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, because it's really impossible for Mr. Norris and I to articulate how difficult the situation was for humans, it's really not that hard to believe that some humans didn't want to be in this system and were willing to revolt and possibly put their life on the line in order to break away from this bondage. Slave revolts were a real part of the time. Now, they were not something that happened very often, but they were something that did take place. And it says our open revolts took place on ships and in cities like New York and Charleston. Also, work slowdowns were another way of slaves really revolting, and they took place on plantations or farms at times.
You mentioned work slowdowns, Mr. Lawrence, and it's interesting when you look at it. Rebellions did occur, but they didn't occur very often because punishments, as we'll see, are so strict. The most common form of resistance by slaves was doing things like faking illness or breaking tools or by working slowly. That was more of a passive way to resist slavery. Also, because of the inhumane treatment and living conditions, many slaves wanted to revolt for those reasons. But another big one was the breakup of families and this idea that children would be sold from their parents and moved many miles away and possibly never see their parents again and forced to be slaves on another plantation. So let's talk about the punishments that slaves faced for resistance or rebellion, and they were wide in variety and extreme as well. They could suffer extreme physical abuse, which was very common. You would see that slaves would often get whipped or beaten by their slave owners, and in some cases, especially for revolts or rebellions, that's where execution would come in.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, one of the last things that we're going to talk about for today is the idea of really cultural diffusion, the term that we're stealing from global and applying it to our American history, because even though millions of Africans were forced into this institution of slavery, cultural diffusion still does take place. So the question asks, what are some examples of culture that came from African slaves during the early development of the Americas? And just a quick list for you that we can be aware of and that we'll talk more about as we go through the course, but things like language, farming methods, food, literature, music, and architecture will just be a brief example of different cultures that will be intertwined to really create this new American culture that's developing at the time.
Yeah, many slaves will actually develop a hybrid of cultures between American culture and African culture. So you'll see this new distinct culture emerge for slaves that is a combination of both African and American culture. So when we're finished up with this video now, we'd like you to turn in your video question response sheet in your packet, and this one is for video number 6. Please answer the following question in at least 3 sentences. How did the triangular trade promote the growth of slavery in the Western Hemisphere? And we will check this in the next class. Thank you guys for watching and have a good day.